All right, welcome to the Bonita Democratic Council. I am Brittany Allison and am thrilled to have this conversation with Senator Anthony Portantino. Thank you so much for joining our club this evening for a conversation on looking forward locally. Before we get started, on looking forward, we also want to look back. And before we look back, we also want to give you a time to introduce yourself. So if you could introduce yourself possibly by reflecting on this past year, challenges or triumphs, maybe something that you're most proud of, or anything else that you'd like to open the floor with. We are all ears.
Well, thank you, Brittany. And it's nice to be here and to see a bunch of old friends. You know, we've all been through a lot. This past through the pandemic. I mean, it's something that came with no playbook, something that was unprecedented, something that, you know, of historic proportions and, you know, affected all of our lives in different ways, but affected everybody. So clearly it's been a trying time. And happy to share a little perspective with you. Again, I'm Anthony Portantino. I represent the 25th State Senate District, which starts in Upland and goes all the way to Sunland, Tujunga along the 210. And so about 18 communities along the 210 and stretches through a little bit of San Bernardino, but mostly LA County. It's an education center district, I like to tell everybody. I mean, with obviously those of you who know Laverne and know the Claremont Colleges, you know, that's just one perspective of the district and a very important one, but it also has a number of community colleges. Citrus, GCC, PCC, Mount Sac serves part of the district, and LA Community College serves part of the district as well. And of course, it's got Woodbury on the other side and Caltech in the middle, and probably 20 some odd school districts throughout the district, and a ton of high schools and middle schools. And I like to say it's reflective of California. It's very ethnically diverse, and it has from those amongst us who need the most help and those amongst us who can give a lot of help. So it really covers the spectrum, both ethnically and economically. And so proud to represent it. I've raised two daughters in the district. We talked a little about that before, 20 and 30. They're a decade apart, and it took me a decade to recover. So that's why they're a decade apart. That's a joke. You can laugh at that. But my 20-year-old is a sophomore, or what they call now a froshmore, because she missed her freshman year because of COVID at University of Redlands. So not too far from all of us. And so she's having a good time. Her spring break was last week, so I got to spend a little time with her. I think the biggest issue, you know, frankly, in the last couple of weeks is, you know, it appears as if we're coming out of the pandemic, you know, getting a little bit back to normal, you know, with the mask mandate being relaxed and you know, indoor activities coming back and vaccination rates going up. We all can try to get back to some semblance of our regular life, but I don't think any of us just can turn on that switch and say, all right, everything's fine now. I think there's going to be a gradual, you know, sort of awakening and understanding of what it means. And I think an appreciation. I think one thing that we've developed during the past couple of years is to appreciate what we weren't doing. And I think we'll appreciate that. We talked a little bit about wellness, you know, the number of people who started walking and riding their bike and exercising was significant. And then, you know, since I've lost a lot of weight, people come up to me and volunteer how much weight they've gained. So I think that's also something that's happened during the pandemic. Some people who didn't take the time to exercise, but maybe started baking. Early on, there was a lot of data about how baking was very cathartic and beneficial. And so I know there was a big run on white flour during the first year of the pandemic. We ran out of flour because so many people were baking. And of course, when you eat all those wonderful baked goods, it starts to affect your waistline at the same time. And so people came through it, you know, as best they can. What I really, you know, deeply think about more than anything else are our kids. You know, before the pandemic, you know, the world was complex and kids were struggling with depression and other forms of mental health issues. And, you know, now 1 in 5 high school kids, 1 in 5, think about committing suicide. I mean, that's a staggering statistic. And so for me going forward, that's where I'm putting a lot of my efforts on mental health issues. Last year, I closed a loophole in California law that had mental health being treated differently than physical health for school students. If you had a broken ankle or you had a cold, that was an approved absence from school. But if you were home with depression or anxiety, that was not an approved absence. And so think of being a 14-year-old and wondering if your teacher is going to accommodate your mental health condition. And if you miss a test, how much more anxiety that adds to your day. And I tell everybody, I actually had an editorial board with one of the major newspapers early on when I put the bill in. And one of the editors said, well, what happens if a parent lies on the excuse note? And I said, well, the fact that you asked that question and you don't say, well, what happens if the parent lies about Johnny having a cold? Why would you assume they would be lying over, anxiety or a mental health issue? The fact that you asked that question is why we have to have the bill, because mental health is just as traumatic to a 14-year-old as physical health. Another effort that I've been trying to do, we all have, many of us have learned CPR. And those of you, Jose and others who work in institutions, that there's training for those folks on campuses in CPR for physical, help, for first aid. But we don't do the same thing for mental health first aid. And so I have a bill to make sure that 75% of all school personnel are trained on mental health first aid to understand the warning signs of suicide. And when I presented the bill last year, a father called in to testify, and he said, my 14-year-old daughter turned in her English assignment, her journal as an English assignment. She got an A on her assignment, and then 2 weeks later took her own life. And he said, I don't blame the teacher for not seeing the warning signs of suicide in her journal because the teacher wasn't trained to see the warning signs in her journal. But shame on us if going forward, we don't train our school personnel to see the warning signs. And believe it or not, there's a lot of pushback because folks don't want to have the training and they don't want to do it. And my point is, we're not asking them to be frontline medical professionals. We're just asking them to be able to direct a student who needs help to the right place. And so I see Tracy there. How was your birthday, Tracy?
It was good. How was yours?
Not too bad. Not too bad. Our birthdays are very close. So we always try to celebrate together.
I'm older though, so I get, more kudos.
I didn't say that, you did. So mental health going forward, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. I'm trying to do a wellness approach on every campus. So I've got a bill this year going forward to try to create a wellness grant for every campus to have either a wellness professional or wellness center on every campus. As you know, Bonita, I got some money in the budget last year for the Bonita Unified School District for the high school, for the foundation to do some work on wellness. And it's an issue I deeply care about. It's one of the reasons why I did the late start a few years ago, because, the data showed that when teenagers sleep in the morning, the percentage of suicide or the incidence of suicidal thoughts goes down and other forms of self-medication go down. And so we're working on both the mental health first aid, the wellness. Dyslexia screening is something else. And Jose, you'd be interested in this. They did a study in Texas on a particular prison, and 70% of the inmates were dyslexic. 7 out of 10 inmates were dyslexic in a prison. I mean, again, if we're good suburban parents and, our kid has an issue, we get them to the finest pediatrician like that. But there's a lot of folks out there who, don't have that ability, and a lot of English learners, a lot of families with struggles who don't have the resources to get their first grader screened or diagnosed with learning disability. So I have a bill to mandate dyslexia screening in all first grades in California, just so we can start to identify who has those issues. In my own case, I didn't get diagnosed till I was in the 8th grade with my learning disabilities. And by then it's almost too late, because then people will become politicians or inmates. And, we've got enough of both of those. And so we really need to intervene early in a child's academic life to screen for dyslexia. So I'm very passionate about that. I'll touch upon one thing because I know we want to have a dialogue with folks. I have a very controversial bill, but I think a very important bill on gun safety. We all saw what happened in Michigan, where a school received a credible threat and then didn't do anything. And those of us who work in education, we know that, oftentimes administrators, sometimes overthink or sometimes are cautious. What happens if we're wrong? Will we anger a parent if we investigate? Or, this doesn't happen in our district. It only happens in someone else's district. So we don't have to take that threat seriously. And so in Michigan, they got a threat. They didn't take it seriously. And the kid came in and shot up the school. And so I have a bill that says when a school district receives a credible threat about somebody who is on Facebook or somebody who tells their friends that they're going to go shoot up the school district must investigate it. Already school districts have the ability to search a backpack, a locker, or a car. They have that legal right to do it. My bill says they must contact law enforcement and they must do the investigation. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is when you register your kid for school, you must disclose whether there's a gun in the house and whether your kid has access to the gun and whether that gun is properly locked and stored. And so why is that important? Because God forbid your kid is implicated in one of these shooter incidences, the threat assessment can be weighed whether that kid has access to a gun, because 67% of the time in these shootings, the gun comes from the household. And so I think it's a comprehensive school safety measure to make sure that we investigate credible threats. I'd rather err on the side of, searching a backpack that, doesn't have a gun versus not searching a backpack that has a gun. And so the combination of those issues are important. And then finally, and Tracy knows this, we fund education based on attendance in California. All but 6 states fund it based on enrollment. And so California stands with Texas, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Wyoming in how we fund public education based on attendance. And why that's a problem is school districts have to budget based on their enrollment projection. And whether you have 20 kids in a classroom or 18 kids in a classroom, it costs the same. And so if you budget based on enrollment and then the state takes away money during the year because kids are absent, you're getting penalized. And in particular, urban districts with other issues, other challenges, underrepresented communities, English learning school districts are struggling with attendance right now. And they're disproportionately affected by the way California affects or does funding based on attendance. And so my bill shifts the funding from attendance to enrollment, and that would inject $3.5 billion into public education in California if we did that shift. And my argument is we have somewhere between $40 and $60 billion surplus. We should prioritize our kids. They should get a piece of that surplus. And the school districts should have stability around how schools are funded. And so that's probably the biggest issue that I'm pushing this year is the shift from average daily attendance to enrollment. So with that, I don't know, Brittany, if you want me to take some, I can keep talking about all kinds of stuff. So
I have a few questions and then I'll open it up to the floor. So you mentioned your district being like the education centric district, right? And I see education always being the body that gets caught in the cultural wars, whatever time period it's been in history, right? School is where that controversy, like the heat gets put on. Right now, we're seeing the heat getting put on school boards. You mentioned the gun safety bill and the controversy associated with that. In your years, having so much experience with so many different school boards, what type of wisdom or advice do you have on not just the way to, legislate our way to seeing mental health more comprehensive and legislate our way to there, but actually shift culture, right? How can the people who are in the school districts help kind of mitigate the fire that comes off of some of those controversies?
Well, first, it's a great question. And first of all, I've said for decades that the hardest job in public service is to be to be around kids, whether you're a teacher or whether you're a school board member. Those are difficult jobs because people are passionate about their kids. You know, Dennis and I served on a city council and we regulated people's front yards. People are a lot more passionate about their 10-year-old than they are about the tree in their front yard. And they can be passionate about the tree, but they, you know, so the natural inclination for a school board member in particular, and for a teacher, is people are very passionate. The second part of it that makes it a conundrum is most folks don't feel like they're an expert in the world. So people who aren't lawyers don't think they're experts in the law. People who aren't city council members don't think they're an expert in local government. But when it comes to education, everybody went to school. And so everybody harkens back to their own 5th grade teacher, and they all feel, you know, that they have an expertise in education because everybody went to school. And so that also makes it a very, very difficult profession. And so what I try to do is, and what I've observed is, there's a way to be principled and measured. And that's the key, is most folks can handle a disagreement as long as they know you're coming at it from a point of principle. It's when they think you're being arbitrary or political, or you're following without thought. And so that's been the experience that I have found. You know, again, I was on a city council in a very heavily Republican area, and I never hid the fact that I was a Democrat. But I learned during my 8 years on the La Cañada City Council to explain myself. And when people knew that I had a thought process, they would send me emails and say, you know, I disagreed with you the other night, but I appreciated the fact that you explained yourself. Or even now, I'll get an email saying, hey, I saw your vote, but I know you had a reason. It's when you can't explain it that people get mad at you. And so that's what I tell folks is take the time to explain yourself and show that you've thought it through. And I give an example. When I ran for the assembly, I had a very devout man come up to me who I'd known through youth sports and, you know, around town, and, you know, nice guy and very conservative. And he came up to me, and he's soft-spoken gentleman. He said, Anthony, you know, when you go to the assembly, you know, please don't make it about the gay agenda. And I looked at him and I said, well, my older brother's gay, and I'm not going to tell him he has any less rights than anyone else in our society. And the man happened to be an attorney. I said, and you're an attorney, and you took an oath to uphold the Constitution and defend and protect the Constitution. And I said, and our founding fathers used the word all. They didn't use the word select. And so we should make sure that all Californians have the same rights and privileges and the ability to love the people that they love. And so he went, I understand. So this is a man who had a core value disagreement with me. And, you know, every single time I send out one of those mass mailings, I get $100 from the guy. And every time I run for office, he puts a yard sign in his yard. And that's a man who we have a core value disagreement. But because I took the time to explain to him why I support LGBT rights, I didn't say, well, it's the Democratic platform, or it's in, or there's, you know, I explained my personal connection to the issue and why I believed in it. He could handle the disagreement. And that's, I think, what's missing a lot in politics is folks will say, well, it's the party's platform and I got to do it. That's not a reason. It's a reason if you believe it. So if you believe it, articulate it. Long-winded answer. I apologize. I'm Italian.
No, no, I love it. And speaking of hearing your reasoning, I would also like to give you the opportunity, and for my own good, to hear some of the reasoning behind that controversial gun safety legislation. Would you like to highlight what that controversy is and what your reasoning is?
Well, frankly, the left and the right don't like the bill. I mean, the right doesn't like it because I'm making folks disclose whether there's a gun in their house. Mm-hmm. Now, the reality of it is that's not a public disclosure. That's for the school district to have in their database. So if there's a threat, law enforcement can assess the level of the threat. Mm-hmm. So that's my reasoning there is if I was a principal and there was somebody making threats to my school, I'd want to know if that kid had access to a weapon. And so that's
Yeah.
the nexus there.
Wouldn't they, if they're required to investigate with the police department, then, I mean, wouldn't the registered gun be able to be discovered at that point? Is it
Well,
just
not
to be in
everybody,
that spot?
not everybody has a registered gun. Not everybody, if you inherited grandpa's, hunting rifle, that's not necessarily on somebody's list.
Mhm.
And so I want to make sure that the school district has that information available. So that's what the right doesn't like.
Mhm.
The left doesn't like the search part. But again, under California law, you can already do those searches. That's not a change in the rights privileges of a school district to say that you can search a backpack. And so my point is, we know when these threats happen, take them seriously and investigate it. So that's my, and as I said, we just saw in Michigan what happened when a school district didn't follow the threat. People died.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I caught wind of that controversy and some parents' concerns with it. Literally a day before I filled out my daughter's questionnaire for her doctor's visit that also asks if there's access to gun in the house.
Right.
So to me, that was a very common question. But does anybody have any questions on some of what we've covered thus far? I have lots. But if anybody has any questions about the education that we've talked about so far, the cultural war, the controversy, Tracy.
Hi, so I have a question. The school districts all have, and all the schools are on a dashboard now. And the dashboard includes the testing, the language arts and math testing, but it also includes things like chronic absenteeism and suspension rate. And I'm curious, when that was first discussed, it was supposed to include demographics, so you can compare how the demographics of one school district compares to another. And now we have suspension rates. And I'm curious as to how we are responsible for whether or not students come to school. And the suspension rates, we've fixed that by simply not suspending anyone, but that doesn't mean bad behaviors aren't happening. So I'm just wondering what the legislature is thinking about when they make those rules without comparing things that are actually important in the school districts.
Well, Tracy, you actually hit one of my favorite topics, the whole suspension issue, because you're 100% right. When we outlawed suspension, we dealt with the symptom, not the cause.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that a lot. We lowered the recidivism rate in California because we changed the definition of recidivism. And then we said, oh, look, we lowered recidivism by 40%. If we're not dealing with the root cause of the behavior, whether it's lack of meal, lack of, intervention because of a learning disability or an emotional issue, if we're not dealing with the root causes, we're not serving the kid. And so, I agree with you that oftentimes we focus on the statistic and not the individual. And that's one of the things that I fight a lot with folks up here, because these are always good intentions, but unless you drill down, we're not really helping as many kids as we need to be helping. So you highlighted an issue that I agree with.
It's huge. And invite me sometime. Let me talk to some of your colleagues, because we are not helping the kids by simply not suspending them. And I don't necessarily think suspension is the answer to bad behavior, but saying chronic absenteeism is the fault of the school and not a problem with the society in general. I feel like that we have like super huge important things to deal with in schools, like mental health and dysfunction in society, but we end up just putting it on schools as, well, you can't suspend kids. So invite me up sometime and let me chat with your friends and your colleagues, okay?
Absolutely. The other thing is in the switch from attendance to enrollment, 30% of the new money has to be spent on going after absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, truancy. So 70% will be discretionary and 30% will be school districts will have to use it to deal with those structural issues.
And I guess that's kind of the thing I was getting at with, like, we can't legislate ourselves out of a cultural issue or a societal issue, or, you know, and we're all here because we like legislation. You're here because you are a legislator. So maybe it's a funny question of like, what can we do outside of that? Or is it the way that we package legislation, the resources and support that come along with legislation? Like, to your point about spending 30% on chronic absenteeism, I mean, I've heard some educators mention that, like, if that's not something that their particular district struggles with, then are they going to just have to figure out what to throw that money at? I think that there should always be a creative solution that, I mean, because there's so many unique ways that you could deal with chronic absenteeism that will be a net positive for the entire campus culture. But
Right.
if they aren't thinking like that, and if there isn't the resources that come along with these good intentions, then that's where, you know, the legislation doesn't accomplish what it seeks to accomplish.
Right. The other thing too, there are school districts that are already doing a good job and they have truancy officers and departments. The other amendment we've added to the bill, actually just yesterday, is to allow districts to supplant their current efforts. So if you have a truancy officer, you don't have to hire another one. You can say, well, wait a minute, we're already spending X amount of dollars on these efforts. And so that 30% can be assigned to that. So it really creates more discretionary funds for those districts that are doing a good job. So we're trying to be thoughtful about it. And I think the 30% with the supplanting hits the sweet spot.
I would really like to suggest that we not say that districts are doing a good job or a bad job when it comes to attendance, because Ontario Montclair works really hard at getting kids to come to school, but there's just a societal thing that goes on in certain districts that's just not the important thing for some families, or they have issues with getting their kids to school. And it's not the school district who can actually help, and we can't legislate it to be better. We need to convince that portion of society that it matters. So
well, that's where the outreach comes into effect. I mean, I know a school that has what are called chasers, and each chaser is assigned to 50. This particular school, it's, you know, reformed gang members, and they go chase them. They literally knock on their door and chase them into class. They're called chasers. The other thing, and you started talking about it, Tracy, is transportation, you know, is a big deal. And so there are efforts in this year's budget to increase the transportation funding for school districts, because if we can't transport kids, that's another thing that keeps some folks away from school, is they don't have an ability to get there.
And we've changed the amount of the distance that the kids need to live far, you know, how far away they live from school before they get busing. And that's changed. That's made a huge difference in our kids getting, in my district, our kids getting to school. So again, please talk to me, because my district works hard at getting our kids there, but there's lots of impediments to this, and it's not all a legislative thing. So,
and that's why shifting to enrollment matters, because those socioeconomic issues, those cultural issues you alluded to, are disproportionately affecting the kids who need the help the most. And so, you know, that's why it's the right thing to do.
Anthony,
Right.
This is
Yeah,
Dennis Bertone. I want to say I really appreciate the legislation that you're trying to pass. And as a high school teacher and counselor for 38 years, mental health is extremely important. And it's something that we really ignored. And I think all the work you're doing is just wonderful. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, well agreed. I mean, you've shared so much vision for ways in which you are, you know, seeking to really make our communities better and stronger overall. I'm wondering if there's anything else that you like, what's your greatest vision and hope for our communities, for California? And then kind of speaking to a little bit of what we've already talked about, what are some ways that you feel like community members or community stakeholders could better collaborate in order to bring that to fruition? What do you wish people were doing more of or less of to kind of move that forward?
Well, you touched upon it earlier, the culture wars that we're seeing. It's hard not to be emotionally affected by it. I mean, I had a conversation with my daughter last week, about what's going on in Texas and Florida towards the trans community and the don't say gay bill in Florida and, going after trans parents for, abuse. I mean, those issues are really affecting our young people. And I think what we all have to do is just be ambassadors around those cultural issues and make sure that we reframe them. One of the things I did early in the pandemic, when I talked about a mask, I said, I wear the mask because I love my neighbor. It's not about me. And I tell the story about a guy who had a positive test who was in line at the DMV and somebody was mad at him for wearing a mask. He says, I'm wearing it because I care about you. I just had COVID and I don't want you to get it. And I think that's where we can all be ambassadors of sort of goodwill and esprit de corps, and just make sure we wrap our efforts in that sense of loving thy neighbor and treating people. And it's hard because some people don't want to hear it. But I think that's something that we can do with the cultural wars and, talk about, our friend or our neighbor or our cousin, whether they struggled with mental health or whether they're struggling with, gender issues, and share our personal stories as much as possible. I mean, I talk about my brother's suicide all the time because I want people to know that, it affects all of us. I mean, I talk about my, struggles with dyslexia because I want people to know that, they're not alone. And I was in a meeting with some lobbyists one day and I mentioned it, and a guy talked about, or actually a guy was talking about his daughter. And I said, well, you tell your daughter her senators are dyslexic. And the dad started to cry because he felt so emotionally connected at that moment about his daughter knowing that I was a dyslexic. And so I think that's where we have an obligation. And on mental health, after my brother's suicide, the number of people who came up and talked to me about their own family who never mentioned it before I joined the club, but then felt comfortable talking about it. And so I think we can all be ambassadors. Now on legislation in particular, writing letters, getting the club, getting others to support particular public policy, engaging in that discourse, that's important as well. But I think in our daily lives, there's that old quote that's been attributed to St. Francis, though I understand St. Francis never actually said it, but it's been attributed to him, that says, preach the gospel every day, but sometimes use words. But I think that's a great quote. Preach the gospel every day and sometimes use words.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And it's such a good message to hear, because I know for myself and probably for others on this call also, maybe I'll just speak for myself. Like I try to do that. I actually think that I approach advocacy in our local communities through like a very loving, gentle lens, but yet still get called out as a partisan radical because I am in this club, right? This club being the Bonita Democratic Council. So like when partisanship has gotten so heated and so polarized, is that enough, or is there something else that we need to do?
I'll give you an example. So, I served on a city council in a conservative city. And if you remember when the Patriot Act was being discussed, lots of city councils around California were passing resolutions condemning the Patriot Act. Now, those city council resolutions don't mean anything, okay? And they look partisan. So what I did is I went to my church and their Justice and Peace Ministry, and we brought in constitutional scholars and clerics, and we brought in experts on civil rights and how during times of crisis, we've given away our freedoms during times of crisis, and why the Patriot Act was dangerous. And so I actually moderated a panel discussion with constitutional and historical scholars on the issue. So that way people knew, and we had over 150 people come to the discussion. And so my point is, that was a principled way to let the public know where I stood. and an academic approach versus having a city council resolution that may or may not have passed that was bullshit. And so I think the sort of separate the theater from the substance, and then it becomes more principled and less political. Now, you're right, in our times, that's harder to do, but it also is a better way to go. The other thing that we who work in partisan politics, it's hard to criticize our own team. You know, no one likes to hear a criticism out of a Democrat of another Democrat. But if somebody does something wrong, don't be afraid to say, I disagreed with that. Because if you show the public your principles and your consistency, then when you take a position, it has more power than if you're just look like you're following along. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I appreciate that so much. I'm gonna open it up to some questions. We've got some good questions in the chat from Matt. Certainly thanking you for your mental health work first and foremost.
Matt, how's your dad?
Matt, how's your dad?
You know what? He is doing well. Unfortunately, I think he wishes he could be here tonight, but he had his chemo treatment today, so he's probably taking it a little bit easy.
Well, tell him I said hello and I asked about him.
I will.
I like him better than you.
Well, thanks. I like him better most days too.
You know, I'm only
Wonderful.
kidding.
But Matt furthermore brought up the question about teachers' salary and that they can't live in the communities that they work.
Right.
And if you're like our community, the rest of the community will fight against income housing that they would be able to live in. So are there any work in the legislation on education workforce housing?
You know, there have been a number of bills to help school districts use surplus property to build workforce housing. My SB 15, which repurposes dormant retail. So we all know that there's a lot of malls out there that have gone out of business, and with the change of shopping habits, there's going to be more and more dormant retail. And so I have a bill to help cities convert that dormant retail into workforce housing, specifically to help working people.
Did you know that, Matt?
I don't know if Matt knew that or not.
I don't know. That's
but
awesome.
those are things. And now, frankly, I get knocked by some of the housing folks because I promote affordable and workforce housing. And there's this notion that of supply and demand, that all we need to do is just increase the overall supply. And, my point is we should make sure that we put some guardrails around that to make sure that we're addressing the affordable and the workforce needs of the state.
Yeah, very good. Very true. I think I saw Eric's hand first and then Jose.
Good evening,
Hey, Eric,
Senator.
how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. I actually wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on Democrats not criticizing each other, because I actually feel it's the opposite. I feel that as soon as our guy messes up, we're all over them, right? We're a circular firing squad. I think my experience has been it's the other side that doesn't ever criticize them. And so I wondered if you could talk about that, because I feel like we are constantly going after our own to our detriment. Would you not agree?
Well, I don't know if criticism might not be the right word. What I'm saying is, be an individual in your politics. Make sure the public knows that you're being thoughtful about your positions, and don't be afraid to disagree in a sense. I'm not saying if somebody messes up to attack them. That's not what I'm saying. But like the housing issue, I get attacked from folks because they think I'm, not progressive enough on housing policy. But I believe that if you only, use the free market, that's not guaranteeing that we're going to get what we want. And so I'm breaking with what some people are calling new urbanism as a political philosophy. And I've been articulating my position. That's what I'm trying to say is, you don't have to be dogmatic in your policy positions just because it might be a platform or someone else is saying it's progressive. Look at the underlying issue. And if you have a different perspective on it, be confident in your perspective. And I think when the public sees that you're engaging in the dialogue, they'll respect your positions more than if you're just following along. So it's not criticizing, it's don't be afraid if you see a nuanced difference. Let me back up. When I first got in this business, when I wasn't all full of gray hair, we wanted our leaders to be thoughtful. We didn't want them to just say the simplest answer to a question. We wanted to know that they had a thought process. We've changed that dynamic to now people just want red meat. And what I'm saying is make thoughtful hip. Does that make sense, Eric? Not criticizing or throwing darts at somebody, but make the conversation bigger, not narrower.
Okay,
You mean
that makes
Twitter
sense. Thank you
debates
for
are
that.
not adequate?
Twitter debates are that's a bet. See, Brittany, you phrased it in a much more hip way than I did.
That's because I'm trying to make being thoughtful hip again.
There you go.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's great. Jose?
No, Anthony, I just wanted to thank you for taking the leadership on education issues. We've been part of this College for All coalition that's probably 70 organizations throughout the state. And before the pandemic, you saw us in buses coming to Sacramento. And then when the pandemic happened, we continued to have advocacy online. And I did want to thank you for first helping to pass SB 1050, which resulted in over $200 million to schools for college readiness. And I know we work with Pomona School District, and with the parents, we were able to get $101 million, and it really changed the number of students graduating and going on to college. And then recently, thank you again for SB 309, which ensures that every school district throughout the state, I think that one was $540 million, as many students as can finishes A through G requirements. And the future impact on foster youth, on low income, on English learners, I already see, I'm still teaching at Pitzer, and we're already seeing students coming in that are being followed through as a result of that funding. And so, there's so many bills lately. The one that allowed to change and make it easier for students who are graduating from junior college to go to university, compact that. And then I personally know students who have benefited from having options during the pandemic period to be able to, if they want to take an incomplete, if they want to wait another year to graduate. So anyway, I saw your efforts on all those bills, and I just wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure, Jose. And I'm working with the AICCU this year, the nonprofit colleges, because as you know, many of the nonprofit colleges are far more diverse than the public colleges, and they're graduating kids in 4 years, not 6 years.
That's right.
And some of them, it's 60% of the population are first-time college-going families, and so they're not getting the same Cal Grant love as the UC and the Cal State, and that's disproportionately affecting underrepresented communities. So I'm working with Claremont and Laverne and all of those schools to try to equalize Cal Grants, because those kids need it and the schools do well with it. So we've got to help. The other issue and I'd love your take on it, and we don't have to deal with it tonight, but I'm getting a little pushback on the dyslexia screening because folks are concerned about, the impact on English learners. And we put safeguards in the bill, ethnic sensitivity and language sensitivity, but to say to an entire group of students, we're not going to screen you because we're worried about making a mistake. It's not helping the, when we know so many of those kids do struggle with learning disabilities. I'm getting a little pushback from some of the social justice groups and it's the right question, but if we have the safeguards, we should be able to screen a first grader who speaks Spanish with a Spanish speaking screener. And so that's what we're building into the bill. So I'm getting a little pushback from that community. So if you hear of it or think of any strategies, let me know down the road. Okay, my friend?
Yes. Well, thank
Are you
you.
saying you're getting pushback even when there is the provision for it to be done in a native language?
We're getting pushback even when we're putting all the restrictions around it because folks are afraid again, it's the right question. And if you go back into the 1970s when students of color were tracked into certain professions and told you can't go to college, go take shop, so there's legitimate tracking concerns, but sometimes those folks don't like the right answer. And again, that goes back to Eric, you can't be afraid to say, but we're fixing that problem going forward. And, don't hold me accountable to what happened in 1972.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to that issue of not seeing the nuance in anything, right? Like sometimes we it's as if we've been, I don't want to use a word like trained or programmed, but like we have been so inundated with like this if you are pro this, you must be anti this. If you are anti this, you must be pro this. But there are so many more layers to explore there. Jose, did you have another question? No. Okay, let me put your hand. So we are at time. I know that the senator could talk all night, and you all know that I could also
talk all night.
Does anybody have any last burning questions before I give him an opportunity to share his last words and bid adieu? All right. Well, I'm so thankful to be able to have this conversation. I've got the best volunteer job in the world being able to do this. So I have just been thrilled having the opportunity to hear more of your thought process and what excites you and what motivates you. And I guess there is one more question in the chat box. Any post-Senate plans?
I used to say that the difference between me and every other politician in California is they all wanted to be president of the United States and I just wanted to be fat and happy. And I used to say I succeeded and they won't become president. So I can't say that anymore. I'm not fat and I'm happy, but I'm not fat anymore. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I love what I do. I think I have a perspective that's unique in a sense that I just legislate as a dad. And I just try to focus on things that, affect people and kids in a way. And, I do think that's a perspective that we need more of in this crazy world. But I don't know what's going to happen, post that. I have 2.5 more years. I got a lot to get done in those 2.5 more years. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. The other line I used to say is the difference between me and all the other politicians is they give speeches and I eat the chicken. Jose's laughing at my jokes. It's good. Well, it's been great to hang out with all of you. I'll come back again. I see Mr. Ebner here taking care of business. You guys got a great group of folks and, let me know how I can help. And, none of you are shy.
No, not shy at all. Well, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing what's coming and staying in contact with you and in collaboration with you.
Fantastic. Be well, everybody. Take care.